My bike has now done 84,000 k, and at the end of our last 2,500 k ride, my chain was making a nasty noise. So I'm thinking, might be time to change it. It's not all that bad on the back sprocket, but when I look at the chain stretch, it's got some really loose patches and some tight spots. And this was making the chain flap around dramatically. And it sounded a lot worse than that, doing 100 kilometres an hour. So it's time to change out the chain and the front and back sprockets. If I'd been smart, I probably should have changed the front sprocket at about halfway through the 40,000 kilometres that this chain and sprockets has done, because it's the front sprocket that wears out first, and I suspect that this is what's causing the chain to stretch as well, because there's hardly any noticeable wear on the back sprocket, but I'll change it regardless. There are three 8mm head bolts to take out the side cover. And the gear lever needs to be taken off the shaft as well. And that's a 10mm head. By the way, if you haven't got any ratchet ring spanners yet, go and get some. It's better than sitting in a warm bath and eating chocolate. They are so satisfying to use. Oh look, that's where that cable tie went. Next step is to take the bolt off the front sprocket before everything's disassembled. But I need to just slide the gear lever back on so that I can put the bike into gear. That's usually sufficient. I can then get the socket onto that bolt, get a bit of a turn, and off it comes. And it's a 14mm head for this bolt. I unashamedly use clip links to join my chains, and so it's a simple matter of just using pliers to take the clip off, but the plate is actually pressed on and you won't be able to get that off with just a pair of pliers. So my nice old-fashioned, what used to be called chain breakers, but won't break a chain these days, is really good for just taking that plate off. Oh, and by the way, the front cover will almost always have heaps of gunk in it, and so that needs cleaning out as well. As I suspected, the front sprocket is quite worn. It's fairly hooked. There's a lot of wear on the left hand side of those teeth, and the teeth are sort of hooked. Anyway, it's time to take off the back wheel, and that's using a 27mm socket. By the way, you'll probably have noticed already that I didn't loosen off the nuts on the back sprocket before I took the chain and the wheel out. What an idiot. It's much easier to do it with the chain and the wheel still in place, because those nuts are Loctited on, so they're not easy to undo. But if you've watched any of my previous videos, you'll know that I make at least one mistake every time I do any maintenance. So this is mine this time. So I resorted to putting the sprocket in the vise and taking the nuts off that way. No huge loss. The nuts are 19mm. Alrighty then, it's off with the old and on with the new. You really don't want these nuts coming loose, but I'm just using blue Loctite on these nuts, which from experience holds them absolutely fine. The nuts are lock nuts, so theoretically you don't need this, but this is just extra insurance rather than replacing the nuts. I'll tighten these nuts right down once I've got the wheel and chain back in place on the bike. The new chain comes longer than required, but it's no use just measuring the actual length because the old chain is stretched. So I'm lining up the links. I could have also just counted them. You can see here the amount of movement in just one link, so you can imagine the movement over the whole length of the chain. With the link marked that I need to cut, I simply use the angle grinder. You could simply use a punch for this job, but I'm using my old-fashioned chain breaker again to just take off that faceplate. This is the chain I'm going to use. It's the same chain that I've just replaced, and far better than the OEM chains. The front sprocket fits very precisely on the spline, so it takes a little bit of fiddling to get that on correctly. Right, so I've got my little tool, two nuts welded together, that I'll use to press the faceplate of the joining link on. And I've got my joining link faceplate clip, O-rings or X-rings, and a bit of grease. It's just a little bit fiddly. Thread it over the top of the swing arm and in place to put on the front sprocket. Of course, when I go to hook the chain together, it doesn't meet. That's because the new chain is now shorter than the old chain, so I have to loosen off the adjusters. So I'm just counting the number of turns that I loosen off in the hope that I'll still keep the adjusters in line both sides. That's better. So now I know I can link it up together. I'll undo it again so that I can grease up that joining link and put the X-rings in as well. The link comes with a little packet of grease, so there's no reason why not to use that. It's very satisfying doing this sort of maintenance myself. I find it quite therapeutic. It's a straightforward job, nothing difficult about it, but it does take a little bit of time, so there's no reason to rush it. Just like actually riding a bike, the journey can be more fun than the destination. But I do like to sit back and have a look at a job well done. I've moved the link around onto the rear sprocket because it's going to be easier to put on the faceplate and joining link when it's actually on the sprocket itself rather than floating in mid-air. Okay, it's time to press that faceplate on, and as I said, I've just got a couple of nuts welded together that I'll sit over the top of the faceplate and then just use a G-clamp to gently squeeze that faceplate on. I don't want to go too far, I want to go just far enough so that the clip can go in. Okay, so that's not quite far enough yet, I can't get the clip in the little slots. So another little squeeze. Don't want to go too far or you'll damage the X-rings. Just a little bit more of a squeeze and another test, and yep, that's actually got it right in the groove, but not too far. So now I can put the clip on with the rounded part facing forward. I'm making doubly sure that the clip is right in place perfectly, and yep, I'm happy with that. The correct slack is indicated on the swing arm of 35mm. So just using a tape measure, I'm measuring from the top to the bottom to get about 35. I've again counted the terms to tighten the chain up, and I've locked it on both sides, and so now I'll tighten up the axle itself, and then I'll do a final test of the chain tension once everything's back together. And as a double check that my back wheel is aligned correctly, I'm just measuring the adjuster bolt on both sides. The other check is to look at the sprocket position within the chain itself. If the wheel isn't lined up properly, you'll see the sprocket running on one side or other in the middle of the chain there. That sounds much nicer. Running nice and smooth. Now it's a simple matter of Loctiting that sprocket bolt back on, replacing the sign cover, putting the gear lever back on, and Bob's your uncle. Another satisfying maintenance job done, and the bike's as good as new again.